They told me women don't belong under the hood of a Ferrari, but when I fixed what 12 European mechanics couldn't, their jaws dropped to the garage floor. Before we dive in, tell us where in the world are you watching from? If you enjoy stories like this, make sure to hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's episode is truly mind-blowing. Let's get started. The sound of a perfectly tuned Ferrari V8 engine fills the air as I hold up my grease-stained hands, still clutching the keys, to a $500,000 machine that 3 days ago was nothing more than an expensive paperweight. My name is Zelda Hartwell, and I'm about to tell you how a girl from Jacksonville, Florida, proved that sometimes the biggest breakthroughs come from the places nobody expects to look. I never thought I'd be standing in the most prestigious European auto shop in the city, watching grown men who've spent decades working on luxury cars stare at me like I just performed actual magic. But here's the thing about being underestimated your whole life. It teaches you to trust yourself when everyone else counts you out. 2 years ago, I lost the person who believed in me most. My grandfather Buster raised me in his garage, teaching me that engines don't care about your gender, your education, or your bank account. They only care if you can listen to what they're trying to tell you. Buster was a NASCAR mechanic back in the day, and he had this saying, "Darling, the fancy tools and certificates are nice, but if you can't hear what the engine is saying, you might as well be deaf." I thought I understood what he meant back then. I had no idea I was about to put his words to the ultimate test. See, I've been working at Murphy's Auto Repair since I was 16, mostly fixing everyday cars that people depend on to get to work and take their kids to school. Honest work, but not exactly the stuff dreams are made of. While other girls my age were figuring out college or careers, I was learning the difference between a rod knock and a wrist pin, between a failing fuel pump and a clogged injector. But I always had this itch, this need to prove that everything Buster taught me could work on something bigger, something that would make him proud, even though he wasn't here to see it anymore. What I'm about to share with you happened 3 months ago, and it changed everything. It started with me walking into a place where I definitely didn't belong, asking for a job from people who took one look at me and decided I wasn't worth their time. It ended with me doing something that 12 trained professionals said was impossible. This isn't just a story about fixing a car. It's about what happens when you refuse to let other people's limitations become your own. It's about honoring the people who believed in you by believing in yourself, even when you're scared out of your mind. And it's about discovering that sometimes the most expensive education in the world can't replace the simple ability to listen. So buckle up, because this ride gets intense. There were moments when I thought I might lose everything, my reputation, my savings, maybe even my freedom if I damaged a car worth more than most people's houses. But there were also moments that reminded me why I fell in love with engines in the first place, and why my grandfather's voice still guides every decision I make under the hood. By the end of this story, you'll understand why that Ferrari is still purring perfectly today, and why the woman who owns it tells everyone she meets about the mechanic who saved her charity auction and proved that expertise isn't about where you learned. It's about how well you listen when it matters most. Let me paint you a picture of where I was 3 months ago, because understanding my situation makes what happened next even more unbelievable. Every morning, I'd drive my beat-up Honda Civic to Murphy's Auto Repair on the south side of Jacksonville, where I'd spend 8 hours elbow-deep in the engines of cars that had seen better days. Don't get me wrong, I love the work. There's something beautiful about taking a car that won't start and bringing it back to life. But after 2 years of fixing the same problems on the same makes and models, I was starting to feel like I was stuck in automotive purgatory. Murphy's is owned by Tom Murphy, a good man who gave me my first real job when I was still a teenager. He knew my grandfather Buster from the old racing circuit, and when Buster got sick, Tom made sure I had steady work and health insurance. I'll always be grateful for that, but gratitude doesn't pay the bills that keep piling up. See, Buster's cancer treatments wiped out everything we had saved. The medical bills kept coming even after he passed, and I was drowning in debt that felt impossible to escape. My younger brother Colt had just gotten accepted to the University of Florida's engineering program, and I'd promised Buster I'd make sure the kid got his education without starting life buried in student loans. The math was brutal. Colt needed $18,000 for his first year, and I was making barely enough to cover my own rent and groceries. I was working 6 days a week at Murphy's, picking up weekend side jobs whenever I could find them, but it wasn't enough. Not even close. That's when I started noticing the cars that would drive past the shop every morning. Sleek Porsches, elegant BMWs, the occasional Lamborghini or Ferrari heading toward the wealthy Ponte Vedra area. These machines represented a completely different world, one where a single repair job could pay what I made in 2 months at Murphy's. I started researching the shops that serviced these high-end vehicles, and one name kept coming up: Meridian European Motors. They had a reputation for being the best exotic car specialists in Northeast Florida, the kind of place where celebrities and millionaires brought their toys when something went wrong. The head mechanic was a guy named Victor Kozlov, and his credentials were intimidating. He'd trained at the Ferrari factory in Maranello, worked on Formula One cars in Prague, and had certifications from every major European manufacturer. The shop also employed Hans Muller, who'd spent 15 years at a BMW specialty shop in Munich, and Luca Rossetti, whose family had been working on Italian cars for 3 generations. These weren't just mechanics, they were automotive aristocracy, and their shop reflected that status. I drove by Meridian one afternoon after work, just to see what I was up against. The building was spotless, with gleaming floors and state-of-the-art diagnostic equipment that probably cost more than I made in a year. Through the windows, I could see a red Ferrari 458 on one lift and a silver Porsche 911 GT3 on another. Standing there in my oil-stained Murphy's uniform, looking at a world that seemed completely out of reach, I heard Buster's voice in my head. "Darling, engines don't care about your diploma. They only care if you can listen to what they're telling you." The logical part of my brain knew I had no business even thinking about applying at a place like Meridian. I didn't have factory training or fancy certifications. I'd learned everything I knew in Buster's garage and at Murphy's, working on cars that most people would consider beneath the notice of real mechanics. But desperation has a way of making you brave, and Colt's future was depending on me finding a way to make more money. I spent 3 days crafting a resume that highlighted every complex repair I'd ever done, every diagnostic challenge I'd solved, every time I'd fixed something that other mechanics had given up on. When I finally worked up the courage to walk into Meridian European Motors on that Thursday morning in June, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold my application. The shop smelled like expensive leather and precision machinery, and every surface gleamed like it had been polished that morning. I was about to learn that sometimes the biggest challenges come not from the work itself, but from convincing people that you deserve the chance to prove what you can do. Victor Kozlov looked up from his diagnostic computer when I walked through the door, and I could see the exact moment he decided I wasn't worth his time. He was a tall, lean man with grease-stained fingers and the kind of confidence that comes from 20 years of being the smartest person in every room. His eyes swept over my Murphy's uniform, my nervous posture, and the resume clutched in my sweaty hand. "You're here about job posting?" His Czech accent was thick, but his English was precise. "Sweet girl, this is not place for American backyard mechanic. We work on machines worth more than your house." I tried to keep my voice steady. "Sir, I've been working on cars for 12 years. I've diagnosed electrical problems that 3 other shops couldn't figure out, rebuilt engines that everyone else said were beyond repair. I know I don't have formal training, but I can prove that I know what I'm doing." Hans Muller, a stocky German with 4 arms like tree trunks, looked up from the Porsche he was working on and chuckled. "Mädchen, maybe try the Jiffy Lube down the street. They are always needing help with oil changes." The humiliation burned in my chest, but I forced myself to stay calm. "I understand you have concerns about my qualifications, but if you'll just give me a chance to show you what I can." "No," Victor interrupted, waving his hand dismissively. "We cannot waste time with amateur. These cars are worth $500,000. One mistake and owner sues us for everything. You go find jobs somewhere more appropriate for your skill level." Luca Rossetti, who'd been silent until now, finally spoke, up from behind a Ferrari 458. His Italian accent was softer than Victor's harsh Czech tones, but his words cut just as deep. "Bella, you seem like nice girl, but this work requires years of specialized training. These engines, they are like works of art. You cannot learn to restore Michelangelo by watching YouTube videos. I was about to turn around and walk out, my face burning with embarrassment, my dreams of earning enough money for Colt's tuition crumbling, when we heard the rumble of a tow truck outside. Through the large windows, I watched as they unloaded a pristine white 2019 Ferrari 488 Spider that gleamed like fresh snow under the afternoon sun. The woman who climbed out of the passenger seat was clearly upset. Mrs. Charlotte Pemberton was probably in her 60s, with silver hair and the kind of understated elegance that comes with old money. She wore a simple blue dress that probably cost more than I made in 3 months, but her face was etched with worry. "Mr. Kozlov," she said, her southern accent refined but strained. "Thank God you're here. This car just died on me in the middle of Atlantic Boulevard. No warning, no strange noises, just completely shut down. I have the Children's Hospital charity auction this Saturday, and this Ferrari is supposed to be the centerpiece lot. We're expecting it to bring in at least $500,000 for the new pediatric wing." Victor's entire demeanor changed. He straightened up, smoothed his hair, and walked over to examine the Ferrari with the reverence of a man approaching a shrine. "Mrs. Pemberton, do not worry. This is clearly electrical problem in ECU system. Very common on these models. We will have running perfectly in no time." Over the next 2 days, I watched from the corner of the shop where I'd been hoping they might reconsider my application. Victor, Hans, and Luca took turns attacking the Ferrari like it was a puzzle that would yield to their combined expertise. They ran every diagnostic test in their arsenal, replaced the ECU computer twice, checked every wire harness from front to back. They even flew in a specialist from Ferrari of North America, a thin man in an expensive suit who spent 6 hours with diagnostic equipment I'd never seen before. Nothing worked. The car would start sometimes, run for a few minutes, then shut down completely. Other times, it wouldn't even turn over. By Friday afternoon, Mrs. Pemberton returned to find 3 of the most respected European mechanics in Florida standing around her Ferrari looking defeated. Victor's confidence had evaporated, replaced by the kind of frustration that comes from encountering a problem you can't solve. "Maybe Ferrari factory has answer," Victor admitted, his accent thicker when he was stressed. "But we'll take 2 weeks, minimum, for proper diagnosis. I'm very sorry, Mrs. Pemberton." Mrs. Pemberton's face crumpled. "The auction is tomorrow evening. Without this car running, we'll lose our biggest donation of the year. There are children who need that new wing, Mr. Kozlov. This was our one chance to make it happen." That's when I heard it, a faint clicking sound when Victor tried to start the engine one more time. It was barely audible over the shop noise, but something about it made my skin prickle with recognition. That clicking sound triggered a memory so vivid I could almost smell the motor oil in Buster's garage. It was 1992, and he'd been working on a cherry red Corvette that had been stumping mechanics all over town. The symptoms were identical: intermittent shutdowns, perfect electrical diagnostics, and that same barely audible clicking when the starter engaged. My heart was pounding as I stepped forward from the corner where I'd been invisible for 3 days. "Excuse me, Mrs. Pemberton. I think I might know what's wrong with your car." The silence that followed was deafening. Victor's head snapped up from the diagnostic computer, his face flushing red with what I could only describe as indignant disbelief. "Little girl, you think you know more than 3 certified Ferrari technicians and factory specialists?" But Mrs. Pemberton, desperation etched in every line of her face, turned to look at me with something I hadn't expected: hope. "At this point, honey, I'm willing to listen to anyone. What do you think it is?" I took a shaky breath, knowing that what I was about to say would either change my life or destroy any chance I had of ever working in this industry. My grandfather once worked on a Corvette back in '92 that had exactly these symptoms. Everyone thought it was electrical because that's what made the most sense, but it turned out to be a failing crankshaft position sensor. Victor let out a harsh laugh. "Corvette? You compare American muscle car to precision Italian engineering? This is ridiculous." But I pressed on, my voice gaining strength as Buster's teachings flooded back. "The crankshaft position sensor on this Ferrari is located behind the engine block in an almost impossible place to reach. Most mechanics wouldn't even think to check it because Ferrari's computer system should catch that error immediately. But if the sensor is failing intermittently, sending good signals sometimes and bad signals other times. The computer doesn't know there's a problem. Hans looked up from his work, skepticism written across his face. If sensor was bad, diagnostic would show codes. We check all sensors multiple times. That's exactly the point, I said, my confidence building. When the sensor works, everything looks perfect to the computer. When it doesn't work, the engine shuts down so fast that the computer doesn't have time to register the failure and store a code. It's like a ghost in the machine. Luca shook his head slowly. This is not American muscle car with simple problems, Bella. Ferrari engineering is much more sophisticated than what you are used to working on. Mrs. Pemberton looked between us, her face pale but determined. If you're wrong, what happens to my car? The weight of her question hit me like a physical blow. I was essentially asking permission to take apart a $500,000 engine based on a 30-year-old memory and a hunch. Ma'am, if I'm wrong, the engine might need to be completely rebuilt. The labor alone could be $60,000 or $70,000 plus parts. Victor stepped closer, his voice low and threatening. And if you damage this engine, you will be personally liable for repairs. Can you afford $100,000 mistake, little garage girl? My hands were shaking now, and I could feel sweat beating on my forehead. Everything I owned, my car, my small apartment, the few $1,000s I'd managed to save for Colt's tuition, wouldn't even begin to cover the damage if I was wrong. But I could still hear that clicking sound, and I could hear Buster's voice, just as clearly. Darling, trust your ears, trust your gut, and never let fear stop you from doing what's right. Mrs. Pemberton studied my face for what felt like an eternity. You really believe this is the problem? Yes, ma'am, I do. That clicking sound is the sensor trying to find its position signal and failing. It's intermittent because the connection is probably corroded, which means it works sometimes when the metal makes contact and fails when vibration or temperature breaks that contact. She nodded slowly. Then do it. Fix my car. The shop fell completely silent. Victor's mouth opened and closed like he couldn't believe what he was hearing. Hans and Luca exchanged glances that clearly said they thought we'd both lost our minds. Mrs. Pemberton, Victor said carefully, this girl has no training, no certification, no insurance to cover damages. You are making a very dangerous decision. But Mrs. Pemberton had made up her mind. Mr. Kozlov, you and your team have spent 3 days and thousands of dollars on this car with no results. The auction is tomorrow evening. This young lady is offering me hope when everyone else is offering excuses. She turned back to me, and I saw something in her eyes that took my breath away. Complete faith in someone she'd known for exactly 5 minutes. The next 2 hours were the longest of my life. Every bolt I removed, every component I carefully set aside, felt like I was dismantling my entire future along with that Ferrari engine. Victor, Hans, and Luca watched my every move with the intensity of surgeons observing a medical student attempting brain surgery. You are removing intake manifold, Victor muttered, his accent thicker with stress. This is point of no return. If you damage gasket or cross-thread bolt, engine is ruined. My hands were steady despite the fear coursing through my veins. Buster had taught me to work methodically when the stakes were high, to let muscle memory take over when my mind wanted to panic. I need access to the sensor housing, I said, more to myself than to anyone else. It's buried behind the timing cover. Mrs. Pemberton had stationed herself where she could see everything, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were white. How long have you been doing this kind of work, honey? 12 years, I replied, carefully disconnecting electrical connectors. But nothing this expensive. The most valuable car I've ever worked on was maybe $30,000. Hans shook his head and muttered something in German that I was pretty sure wasn't complimentary. Luca crossed himself and whispered what sounded like a prayer in Italian. It took 45 minutes to reach the crankshaft position sensor, and when I finally got my hands on it, my heart nearly stopped. The sensor itself looked perfect. No visible damage, no obvious wear. For a terrifying moment, I thought I'd been completely wrong, that I just destroyed a $500,000 engine chasing a ghost. But when I examined the electrical connector more closely, I found what I'd been looking for. The metal contacts inside the connector were green with corrosion, the kind of oxidation that happens slowly over time in humid climates like Florida's. The corrosion was intermittent, Sometimes the connection would be solid. Sometimes the green buildup would prevent proper contact. "There," I said, holding up the connector for everyone to see. "That's your ghost." Victor stepped closer, squinting at the tiny green deposits. "This little bit of corrosion causes complete engine failure. When this connection fails, the engine computer thinks the crankshaft has stopped turning," I explained, my confidence returning now that I'd found the culprit. "So it shuts down the fuel and ignition immediately to prevent damage. But the failure is so fast that the computer doesn't have time to store an error code. I spent the next hour carefully cleaning the corroded contacts and installing a new sensor, then began the painstaking process of reassembling everything I'd taken apart. Every component had to go back exactly where it belonged, every bolt torqued to exact specifications, every electrical connection secure. By the time I was ready for the moment of truth, the sun was setting outside Meridian's windows. Mrs. Pemberton had been pacing for 20 minutes, and even Victor seemed nervous despite his earlier confidence that I was wrong. I slid into the Ferrari's driver's seat, my heart hammering so hard I was sure everyone could hear it. The interior smelled like expensive leather and possibility. I turned the key, and for one horrible moment, nothing happened. Then the engine roared to life with the distinctive growl that only a perfectly tuned Ferrari V8 can make. But more than that, it stayed running. The engine note was smooth and strong, without the subtle hesitation that had been there before. Victor stared at his diagnostic computer screen like he couldn't believe what he was seeing. All systems showed green. Every sensor reading was perfect. The error codes that had been haunting them for 3 days were completely gone. "Mein Gott," Hans whispered. It actually worked. Mrs. Pemberton's face crumpled with relief, tears streaming down her cheeks. "You did it. You actually did it. The auction is saved." But it was Victor's reaction that truly stunned me. This man who'd dismissed me as a little garage girl walked over to where I was still sitting in the Ferrari, his expression completely transformed. "I have worked on Ferraris for 20 years, he said quietly. "I trained at factory in Italy. I have every certification possible. But I never would have thought to check that sensor because diagnostics said it was fine. You have something I do not have. You listen to the car instead of just the computer." He extended his hand to me, and when I shook it, I felt like I was crossing into an entirely different world. 6 months later, I'm standing in my own garage. Not Murphy's, not Meridian, but a space with my name on the deed. The sign outside reads, "Hartwell Precision Automotive," and underneath in smaller letters, "Specializing in European diagnostics." It's nothing fancy, but it's mine. And every day I walk through those doors, I remember how close I came to never believing this was possible. Mrs. Pemberton kept her word. The Ferrari sold at the charity auction for $750,000. $50,000 more than expected because the story of the local mechanic who saved it became part of its legend. She'd told everyone at the auction about the girl from Murphy's who fixed what the experts couldn't, and word spread through Jacksonville's wealthy car community like wildfire. My phone started ringing the Monday after the auction. A collector, with a temperamental Lamborghini that had been sitting in his garage for 3 months. A businessman whose Porsche was making a noise that 2 dealerships couldn't identify. A woman whose vintage BMW kept overheating despite thousands of dollars in repairs. Each job led to 2 more, and each satisfied customer became a walking advertisement for someone who could listen to what cars were really saying. Victor offered me that job at Meridian, just like he'd promised. Lead diagnostic specialist, 40% pay increase, health insurance, and the respect of my peers. 2 months ago, I would have jumped at that opportunity without hesitation. But standing in that pristine shop, surrounded by other people's achievements, I realized I needed to build something of my own. Hans and Luca both apologized for their initial dismissal, and now they send me the cases that stump them. It's funny how quickly American Backyard Mechanic became the diagnostic genius who saved the Ferrari. People see you differently once you prove that expertise isn't about where you learned, but how well you can solve problems when it matters. Colt's tuition is paid in full, and he's thriving in his engineering program. He calls me every Sunday to tell me about his classes, and last week he said something that made me cry. "Sis, I want to design cars that are as smart as you are at fixing them." Buster would have been so proud to hear his great-nephew talk about carrying on the family tradition in his own way. The hardest part wasn't the technical challenge or even the financial risk. It was learning to trust my own judgment when everyone else was telling me I was wrong. For years, I'd carried this voice in my head that whispered I wasn't good enough, that real mechanics were the ones with certificates and factory training. It took a $500,000 Ferrari and the faith of a desperate woman to teach me that. Sometimes the most important qualification is the willingness to listen. I keep a photo of Buster on my desk, right next to my first business license and the thank you note from the Children's Hospital. His favorite saying is printed underneath. "Darling, engines don't care about your credentials. They only care if you can make them sing." Every time I doubt myself, I read those words and remember that wisdom doesn't always come with a diploma. The Ferrari still purrs perfectly, by the way. Mrs. Pemberton brings it in for service every 3 months, not because it needs work, but because she likes to tell people about the mechanic who proved that the biggest breakthroughs often come from the smallest voices. She's become something of a mentor herself, connecting me with other business owners who believe in giving chances to people who others might overlook. Last week, a young man walked into my shop with an application and a story that sounded familiar. No formal training, just passion and a grandfather who taught him to listen to engines. His hands were shaking as he handed me his resume, and I saw myself 6 months ago, terrified but determined to prove that potential matters more than pedigree. I hired him on the spot. His name is Marcus, and he's got that same hungry look I recognized from my own mirror. Yesterday, he diagnosed an intermittent problem on a Mercedes that 3 other shops had given up on. The solution wasn't in any manual or computer database. He just listened to what the car was trying to tell him. Sometimes the most important thing you can do is give someone else the chance you wished you'd had sooner.